Hi, morning, morning, hi, hi, morning, hi. Good morning. It's the what, 4th? It is. Yeah, I just did an update there from yesterday. It's also St. Francis. Yeah, second night in a row. Okay, so test on Thursday for art history, by the way. Yeah, look at that. Art history, Thursday, yeah. Yep, we are. Yep, so it'll be class 11. CSP will be next week. Yep. Okay. All right, so we are going to do, somehow we're behind a day. I don't know how that happened. I planned everything out. It didn't work. We'll make it up somewhere. All right, so this is our first class on Greek art. We're going to do I might combine it and do 3 classes. I'm not sure yet. But we'll do 3 or 4 classes on Greek art. So we're going to be looking at a few different things today. What I want to do is give you a broad overview of the main characteristics, the main styles throughout all the different periods in Greek art. It's going to be slightly different doing it this way than we've done in some of the other, like Egypt and Minoan stuff. It's bright.
It's bright.
It's bright. So what we're going to do with Greek is we're going to look at basically everything really quickly, but we're going to focus mostly on the early periods of Greek art today. So we're going to talk about where it is, what the history is. We're going to look at some of the early periods of art, but then I'm going to give you kind of an overview. The reason we're doing it that way is because then the rest of the 3 classes, we're going to look at ceramics. Then we're going to look at architecture. Then we're going to look at statuary, at sculpture. So we're going to look at different characteristics of Greek art throughout the next 3 classes. Yeah. Of course, Maximus. Of course. All right, so here's a revised timeline of what we've been looking at so far. Egyptian influence, remember, big, long, 3100 to 30 BC. We've got the Minoans, we've got the Mycenaeans. All right, so where do the Greeks fit in here? Pretty neatly right at the end. So their main period of Greek influence starting at the very early period and then going up to 31 BC. So you have on your handouts this table that kind of gives you all the different kinds of periods that we're going to be looking at. So it's kind of broadly divided up into early Greek and then classical Greek. So basically starting early classical at about 480 to 450 BC, that's kind of your line of demarcation between the early stuff that no one really talks about too much. That's what we're talking about today. And then the rest is classical period. All right, where's Greece? Everyone probably knows. We've already been looking at this area, right? We've been looking at the Minoan culture, which is right down here in Crete. We've been looking at the Mycenaeans culture. And remember, we talked about how the Mycenaeans, they were kind of the ancestors. They were the early Greeks before there were Greeks, right? But they are really a different civilization, so that's why they're divided up. So the Mycenaeans were in this area too. And the main areas, the main settlements of the Mycenaeans are the same places where the Greeks are going to be developing as well. Okay? All right, so let's talk a little bit about Greek society. Before we do that, though, you're going to notice kind of for the first time that studying Greece is going to feel familiar. Studying Greece is going to feel familiar. Studying Rome is going to feel familiar. Why? Because there's a lot of influence in Greek and Roman art in the architecture, particularly the architecture, but also the statuary, the sculpture that we still have today. We are, for better or for worse, absolutely influenced by Greek and Roman art and architecture. You see that all over the place, right? Seniors, we looked at this last year, how there was the, all of the, like the Supreme Court building, the Capitol building, a lot of cathedrals, in fact, come from Roman influence, neoclassical period, right? We talked about that. It's all directly from here, right? So it's going to be kind of for the first time starting to feel like, okay, I recognize this instead of this kind of really foreign, literally and figuratively, way of looking at things that we've been looking at so far. Again, an influence of statuary. Our statuary hasn't really improved much since then. Techniques, tools, sure, but in terms of how it was done and its perfection, it kind of hit its perfection here. They haven't really been able to improve much. There has been improvements, but hasn't been able to improve too much from here.
Is his arm broken?
Yeah, not on purpose.
Okay.
A lot of the parts of it are broken.
Did they actually? Because we see a lot of pictures like that with like either their arms are cut off or like they only have the picture of their head or their head's cut off. Like,
Right.
Is that on purpose?
No, no. That's just time. Looters, people, civil wars, regular wars, stuff gets broken.
Okay.
Yep. My coffee mug gets broken sometimes. It sucks.
Is that on Civil War?
It's not on purpose, usually.
Civil War.
Civil wars. There was a civil war in the school last year. Things got broken. All right, so let's just briefly look at Greek society.
Oh.
We probably know a decent amount about it already just from knowing things. Hercules. All right, so the main place of power was Athens. Athens was where everything was at. This is the Parthenon. We'll be studying about that when we look at architecture. Athens was named after who? Athena, right? Athena. Athena was the goddess of war and wisdom. Yep. Okay. So this is the front. This is the main city state of Greece. As you probably remember from history and from reading other books, there were different city-states. This is where we kind of first get the idea of city-states, individual city-states, all united under one central rule. This is also where we get the idea of democracy from. Right? Democracy is a Greek word. We get it from the Greeks. So we're seeing a development of things that are going to last for the next few millennia and still exist through today. Again, Athens was the place to be. Philosophers, architects, and artists worked in Athens. Sometimes they had massive workshops, mathematical formulas, and then politics. Politics in Greece meant rich men tell everyone else what to do. Hasn't changed that much. The ideal Greek human, so we're not just talking about art here, we're talking about the ideal Greek, right? The ideal Greek was physically and intellectually disciplined and male, right? We're going to see only males depicted early on. Later on, we're going to see some depictions of females as well, and that's going to be a little bit of a shift, but we'll understand that a little bit more when we look at it here in a second. Women were usually excluded from the rest of society and only permitted to participate in public events like weddings and funerals. So again, very different from the Minoan culture, right? But pretty similar to the Mycenaean culture. Slaves, we've talked about this in CSP. Slaves were very common, right? We talked about how the Greeks had a very dim view of people who were not Greek citizens. And there was a vast pantheon of gods and goddesses, right? We all know the myths and the legends. Gods were human-like, often very flawed, and this is going to be reflected in their art. So this is obviously an artist's depiction of what a gathering of the brightest and greatest minds in Athens would look like. It wasn't always very calm. We often think of democracy in Greek as like this, people dressed up in togas. Well, that's Rome. But, the Greek equivalent of a toga, and they're standing there making orations. No, politics was a messy business. There was arguments, there were fights, right? People didn't get along. Very similar to today, in fact. As you can see, this is a pretty realistic depiction. The only guy who's not white in there is a slave who's holding a bottle for his master there on the right. Greek kids are able to walk around as long as they're boys. Women are nowhere to be found in this place of democracy, in this place of rule-making, law-making. This is early. Later on, they would move into places of places of government, palaces of government. But early on, people would just gather in the streets, gather in the city halls or in the city squares and do their business of democracy. Okay, So we're going to look at the early periods, and then we're going to start to go into a little bit more. So there's your chart. You might want to keep that handy as we're going through some things that will kind of help you. What I've done is I've given you the years, the period, the description. So this is, again, going to be a really good cheat sheet for a test right here. You might want to know these things. And then I've also given you a representative work or two, just to kind of give you an idea. Yeah, the test on Thursday will be through this class. Okay. So how did Greek art get to where it did? How were there these developments? At first, very, very similar to Mycenaeans. They kept to the same standards of geometric, simple designs. We're not going to see a lot of statuary. We're not going to see a lot of sculpture, but what we are going to see is a lot of ceramics, and we'll talk about ceramics next class. But we start to see more stylized, more interesting designs compared to what the Mycenaeans did. Remember, we're talking at about a period of 200 to 250 years later. So a decent span of time has elapsed from the latest periods of the Mycenaeans all the way up to the earliest periods of the Greeks. We're looking at circa 760 BC here. And we see chariots, right? 3 horses or 4 horses maybe. These are stylized shields. We see a funeral happening here with things being placed into a tomb. The Greeks are eventually going to abandon this practice, but they carried over some of these very archaic old practices from other neighboring places of placing items in tombs along with their dead. We see maybe mourners or maybe people carrying things, not 100% sure here, but again, another chariot. So this must be the burial, this must be depicting the burial of someone very important. And again, we can tell all that just from a simple vase. We can tell a lot about the early Greek culture from about 760 BC just based on a vase.
So,
Or a crater is called, yeah.
so I don't know miraculous the fox, but I know it's not. Like, the Bingo's horse? No. The Bingo, like, it's on the table. Is that like sacrificing somebody?
He's dead.
Oh, that's a Bingo.
That's a guy. That's a guy. Yep, that's like a funeral pyre or a funeral procession.
Good guy.
So this would be actually a grave marker. And every now and then they would place wine or oil or offerings for the dead person in front of their grave. So this would be a grave marker. Here we have another, it's called an unnamed Greek pottery. This is probably more utilitarian. This was used for, pouring water or oil or wine. We don't know. But again, we see why we call this period the geometric period. A lot of it is geometry. And even the figures are geometric. The way in which they're shaded and drawn, very, very early. Yeah, this is not what you think of when you think of Greek art.
No. That's true. Well,
So dancing maybe? Dancing while pushing a ship.
interesting.
Again, we see that same shield there. Maybe she's saying goodbye to him while holding a tambourine. I don't know. There's a boat, rowers, shield.
Yes, sir.
What's she holding? Not 100%. Okay? So geometric, if you look at your sheet, characterized largely by geometric motifs, meaning designs. So motifs is just another word for designs in vase painting. Clearly divided registers or levels of decoration alternate between different abstract geometric designs, including what's called the meander pattern. The meander pattern, I forgot to tell you what this is. That's what this is. So it's like some sort of a pattern that repeats and goes in and out of itself, right? It's like playing a snake.
Look at maze.
Yep. All right, next we go to the the Orientalizing period. The Orientalizing period is called this because there started to be influence into the Greek islands from the Far East. Not the Far East, that's like Japan, China, the Near East. So places like Assyria, the Akkadians, there was trade happening between these groups. And so you have a lot of influence in terms of what was happening in places like modern-day Syria, modern-day Iraq, Babylon, all those kinds of places, bringing their influence into the Greeks. This is called the Manticlos Apollo. We think this is a god of some sort. Neck is long, hair is long, eyes are kind of bug-shaped. Again, we have that Akkadian, same sort of style coming through. Okay? We have some pottery being done as well. It looks almost identical to Mycenaean, but also to the early Akkadian, Babylonian style of pottery. Very, very similar. In fact, this fooled a lot of early art historians. They thought that maybe these were artifacts from the Near East that were brought in, and then they did more tests and they figured some things out and said, no, actually, this is early Greek. Okay, so not a lot is really happening during this Orientalizing period of a lot of note. We have geometry kind of starting to fall away. We have more of these Oriental style of these Eastern styles of decorations. This is called a pyxis, and lid with a sphinx-shaped handle.
That's really cool.
Yeah. Yeah, so Orientalizing just means that it's getting influence from the Near East. Again, this is not necessarily a very PC term today, but back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, that's when all these terms were coined. And so they called it the Orientalizing period because it came from the Orient. Paleolithic figures, sort of like stick figures. That was more in the geometric period.
Why is that not okay to say?
Because it groups basically a whole continent into one term. People prefer to be called Indian or Chinese or Japanese or something like that instead of just Oriental. It's too broad. Or something. Okay. This is an ivory pyxis. This is basically just a container used for some sort of a ceremony. But we see here the influence from Egypt, right? There's a depiction of a sphinx on top. So there was trade happening between Egypt and Greece during this time as well. And we know, of course, that there was going to be a lot of contact between the Greeks and the Egyptians later on. That's not going to come till later. Okay. But early on, we can see the kind of this melding of cultures. We see the cultures of Greece and also the cultures of Egypt kind of coming together in one. In the Archaic period, then we have this first kind of beginning stages of what we would call Greek statuary. The Archaic period. Again, it's going to look pretty similar to Egyptian depictions of men. And again, all the statues early on, nearly all the statues early on, especially in the Archaic period, are going to be of men. But what makes it similar to Egyptian depictions of men that we've seen? Yeah. Arms straight down. What about the feet? Yep, one in front of the other. The hair is braided, very similar to what we've seen in Egyptian and also in the Orient as well. One thing that's different, though, is we're starting to see depiction of men especially, and then later on women, completely nude. Again, this was this idea of the Greeks for almost their entire history, basically starting here in the Archaic period and then going all the way through to the Hellenic period at the very end, they're going to be very interested in depicting the perfect human. Well, you can't depict the perfect human with clothes on because then you can't see how they're built. So a lot of their depictions are going to be of nude men, right? It's not a sexualized thing. It's nothing, for them that was perverted. It was we're artistically trying to portray what is perfect, right? And again, you go back to what is the perfect Greek that we talked about at the beginning of the class. Intellectually and physically perfect, right? They were always striving for both of those things, physical and intellectual perfection. Okay? So we start to see here these representations of these figures. They're doing representations of youths. We see Kouros is a statue. Kouros is a statue of a man or of a male youth, and Kouré is going to be that of a young woman. Okay? So Kouros and Kouré statues. A lot of these, we don't know who sculpted them. We don't know who did them. Later on, we're going to know more about the names of the sculptors, but early on, we don't. This is just either terracotta or sandstone. Oh, it is marble. You're right. Yep, that one's marble.
How is marble
This is a funerary statue. This is a kore, right? So this is female. And at the time, she's clothed, right? So early on, we're not going to see depictions of females nude. It's only going to be men. I'm sorry? Mm-hmm. So the biggest thing, so there's a few characteristics here of archaic sculpture, especially people. So whether it's men or women, you see a stiffness in the way that they're depicted. A little bit of softness here with the dress, the way that she's grabbing it and holding it, which is kind of a high water mark for this period. But we also see what, Emma? The archaic smile. The archaic smile is going to pop up again and again and again and again throughout the history of art. But this is where it starts, this archaic smile. It's a smile, right? Before then, you don't see a lot of emotion in statues. This is the first time you're going to see some sort of an emotion. It almost looks creepy, right? It's pretty. Later on, you'll see, in this case, it's nice. It's going to get creepy, okay? Pottery is also going to be starting to hit its high water mark here as well. We're going to be looking at this one in much more detail next class, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here. But this one is called Ezekias, Achilles, and Ajax playing dice. We'll get into how it was done. He's around the side. All right, this is black figure vases. This is red figure vases. They're done a little bit differently. This is a crater. A crater is, again, a vessel used in funerary arrangements, done in, there's usually some sort of offering made to the gods at the time that someone is put into the ground or put into the tomb. And then these would be left at the gravesite. So a lot of them were stolen, but some of them survived. So this is showing the Greeks killing a Persian. So this is the death of Sarpedon. I think it was a Persian. Not 100% sure. Greeks and Persians don't like each other. Not fans, right? You have these wars that are happening. What's the name of the wars between the Greeks and the Persians? Punic War? No, Punic War. Is it the Punic Wars? Huh? 3 Punic War? I don't know. My history is rough here, but we also see the development of massive statuary during this period, right? So we're going to see some big statues starting to develop during the Archaic period. Then we're going to see that explode during the Classical period, and we'll look more about that in a little bit. But this is basically what is left of a huge statue called the Colossus of the Naxians. This is the base that it was standing on. Just to give you an idea, it's big, right? This is just the base. Buried. It was buried underground for a while.
No. Why is it the hand like a peach?
Maybe it's just because it's inside the lighting. But this is how big it was. So this is a depiction of how big a person was. And then you have an idea of how big the statue would have been. And then you would have had a temple surrounding it.
Wait, so we don't have that big person, we just have the hand?
That's all that's left of this. Because we have writings, we have inscriptions. So early Greek writings are still existent from this time. Okay, we'll get into architecture. We'll get into how this was built in a little bit. Temples are also being developed around this time during the Archaic period. So the Archaic period is when we start to see the seeds of what we know to be Greece really starting to develop. And then it's really going to get perfected during the 3 classical periods. So this is a temple dedicated to Isis, the goddess, not the group. Right? We still see some statues still laying around. Lots of statues. These temples would have tons of statues surrounding them or on top of them.
Would it be like common people, or would it actually be
gods and goddesses? Yes. Yep, most of this was done out of marble. Lots of marble in the area. So they're using that for carving. For building, they're going to use the local sandstone, limestone, etc. But for the front the sides and the decorative parts of temples are going to be facing everything with marble, right? Harder to carve, but it's going to be really shiny. It's going to hold its shape really well. Again, talking about the archaic smile. Just about every statue has this smile.
Like the bottom left one. She's natural looking.
Yeah. But you also have some some fairly creepy ones, right? Okay, so why did they do this? They wanted to make it look more natural. Instead of someone just having a dead face, they wanted people to look more natural. That's it. It's as simple as that. And sometimes it succeeded and sometimes they didn't. It's kind of like when you learn how to draw something really, really well, you're like, I'm just going to do this on all of my drawings. That's the tendency, right? That's kind of what they were doing during this period. Okay. All right. So we're going to do a quick run through of the rest of the periods. And we're going to cover these more in detail here in a little bit. But I want to give you just a sense of how things are progressing as we move through these periods. We have the early classical period. Yeah. So during this period, we have depictions of people done in marble, done in stone. This is done in sandstone. Actually, no, it's marble. But we start to see people holding things. So they would fashion spears to fit into the sculptures. And we also see a lot, the archaic smile is still there in the early classical, but we're also going to be having more emotion based on the figures, based on the way that the bodies are moving and contorting, right? So this is showing a battle scene. I just realized everyone's here today. How nice. I know. It's so nice. All right, so why would they be depicted like this? So why, yes, it's interesting. Yes, it's a battle scene, but there's another constraint that the sculptor has to work with here. Where would these sculptures be placed such that this guy has to be crouched down, this one has to be medium, this guy can be standing up? In the front of a temple. So in the front of a temple, you've got what's called the pediment.
You can see on the other side the people are just...
Right? You got this guy and then this guy down the ground. So you're going to see these arrangements of these sculptures that are in a pyramidal fashion. And it's not because they're super interested in that. It's just they got to fit in there.
Makes sense.
Okay.
Their hair looks like top ramen noodles.
It does.
Like, that's just weird.
Here's the other thing. We're used to seeing sculptures white.
Yeah.
When we think of Greek sculpture, what do you think of? White, right? Bright white. Absolutely not. They were brightly colored. Uh-huh. Brightly colored, brightly painted. All of them. It all got washed away. It all got wiped away. Weather and...
I like it better
Yeah.
when it's stone.
Yep.
Yeah. I get all really cool.
But these statues that we're looking at, almost all of them have been painted in some fashion. Okay, so it was brightly colored. It would have been really awe-inspiring to go to a temple and see these, right? Not only were they stone, but they were painted. Okay, so in early classical, we have, again, more development of more interesting arrangements of people. Again, more emotion coming through. As we move forward through Greek art, we're going to see the development of emotion more and more and more. Mm-hmm.
Like, why do they depict all the men with, like, super jacked?
Depicting the perfect male form. Every sculptor is going to try to depict the perfect male form.
I don't know if it was, like, because
Trying to make them to a god or something like that.
Well, yeah, and when you are depicting a god, you want to make him look as perfect as possible as well. So you're going to take the ideal human form and depict someone like that. So yeah, I mean, you're not going to see a lot of sculptures of people that look ugly or aren't jacked or whatever. It doesn't mean that everyone in Greece was like that. Certainly not. It just means we're going to depict who we think is perfect, because otherwise, why waste your time on a sculpture that's not perfect, right? So the spear is missing. There would have been a wooden spear or maybe another type of metal. That's been lost. Also, the eyes have been lost. Maybe those were made out of wood, or maybe they were, some other, we don't know. Maybe they were glass, not 100% certain. But this is made out of bronze, right? There's this development of bronze work and bronze techniques. And we're going to investigate that a little bit. What's that?
It's during the Bronze Age, right?
No, this is later than the Bronze Age. But so they knew how to make tools out of bronze, and that's how they were able to develop their statuary work as well, because they were able to work. They were first using tools made out of bronze, but then they started to figure out during the Archaic period, they started to figure out how to make tools out of iron as well. Iron is a lot harder. It's a lot easier to sculpt stone with iron than it is with bronze.
So, if this is made out of bronze, it would have to get really hot to mold it, right?
Yep, it's melted and poured into a mold, and we'll talk about how that's done.
That's right.
Mm-hmm. Next, we're going to move to the High Classical. High Classical is kind of the epitome of what we think of when we think of Greek art. Again, we'll talk about these more in detail. Here we also start to see for the first time the idea of an artist. An artist in the past was just a craftsman, and that's going to come and go throughout our history as we move forward. Sometimes you're going to go through whole periods of time when you don't know who the artists are, but here we start to see that there are artists who are sought after to do amazing work. And this artist's name was Myron. It's a discus.
Yeah, isn't it like
Yep, it's a sport.
a palm tree?
Oh, it's just a stump. That's to hold the statue up.
That's literally.
Okay. So this is the epitome of High Classical. We're gonna dive deep into statuary when we look at High Classical. So I'm not going to show you a lot more right here. As we get into late Classical, we see other artists, and then we start to see more emotion coming into play. And here we see for the first time female nudes, right? Goddesses being depicted nude for the first time. So there's this shift from, all right, we're only going to depict men, to now we're going to depict women this way too. Why this shift? Was it a change in culture? Was it a change? We don't know. Don't know. Maybe it's just more acceptable over time.
So is that like a depiction of goddess?
Uh-huh. Yep.
Is that like their ideal form?
Yes. Yep. So every depiction that we see here is going to be what the Greeks considered the perfection of male beauty, female beauty. Okay? And again, it wasn't a sexualized thing for them at all. It was purely, we're just trying to be pragmatic here. Late Classical again, and you're going to see, Max, like you saw, we're going to see these stumps all over the place. This is to just help hold the statue in place. Later on, you're not going to see that. They're going to become more advanced and figure out how to make the statue balance on its own. But that's just a support. And so you try to make it look as natural as possible. So this is a little bit destroyed. His fingers are gone. You know, parts of this other support are gone. Parts of his face are gone. But he's bearing a spear. He's holding a spear and offering it to someone in battle. A motorcycle? A stand-up motorcycle. It's a Segway. He's on a Segway. So emotion's going to start to really come in. Also, the development of sculptural techniques. And again, we'll talk about this in a lot more detail. Then we get to the Hellenistic. People either love this period or hate this period. Some of the really more snobby art historians really hate this period. They feel like the emotion is way overdone. I like it. I think it's good. This is called the Dying Gaul, or maybe it's called the Dying Slave. There was a whole series of these types of statues done. There's a whole series of these. There was a whole series of these statues done of slaves or dying people that were captured in battle. Why? Why would you depict this? If you're a sculptor, why would you depict this? Why would you depict a slave or a Gaul? Not just because of what's happening. Nope, not to show what's going on.
Show all classes of people.
Nope. Tony?
Because there's a lot of emotion that you can put.
Uh-huh. Yeah. He wanted to try to do emotion. He wanted to show negative emotion. You're going to start to see negative emotion coming through for the first time in the Hellenic period.
Isn't Hellenistic the queen?
Why is it like so shiny?
Comes later.
You see a side piercing.
It's polished.
On the side of his.
Yep. Obviously predates our Lord, but this is how he dies, right? He also has a rope around his neck. This is how we know he's a slave, right?
Oh, really? The surfboard.
I'm sorry? That's just the stone. That's just a vein of color in the stone.
Were slaves weren't always black. They could be.
Oh, no, they were almost never. They were just anyone who was captured. Anyone who was captured. So the Greeks would go up and conquer, during this period, the Greeks would go up and try to conquer all different parts of what we consider Europe.
Diversity of slaves.
Absolutely. Some would, yep, some would be black, some would be Egyptian, some would be from all these places. All right, so why not depict a Greek who's suffering? Because you don't depict a Greek who's suffering. Greeks are perfect. So you have to use a slave to depict suffering emotion. So this was a way for sculptors to kind of figure out how to
Angel
do emotion.
The casting is
I love
really
this. Like the clothes is so cool.
Just, it's very sheer, right? It's barely there. The head is lost. That's not on purpose. This is the goddess Nike. We call it Nike today. Nike meaning winged victory or victory. Okay. This is done out of terracotta, so this is more sculptural. They're able to take that and sculpt it instead of carve it, right? So this is called additive sculpture. We'll talk more about that later. Additive sculpture is where you add things on and make, like clay or terracotta, compared to carving something away.
What's the dessert? It's not terracotta. It's
Tiramisu,
That's what I was thinking.
panna cotta, panna cotta. That's it.
What's it
Okay.
called again? Panama?
Panna cotta,
Oh,
panna cotta. And then during the Hellenistic period, again, this is a Greek and this is a bronze, right? This is a bronze,
Yeah, look at his.
but it's showing him in his older period. This is a boxer. Yep. So he's an older Greek who is a boxer, who's a fighter, right? But we see the sheer amount of detail, right? Casting in bronze is hard. It's probably harder than carving in marble. It's really difficult to do that. Yeah.
They carve something and then put a plaster on it?
Yep.
They have
So-
too much talent.
So you said something interesting. The Greeks had way too much time on their hands. To them, this was the epitome of what you do. It was learning, it was the arts, right? And it was also athletics, right? That's where we get the Olympics from, right? The Olympics come from Greece. And the early Olympics, both in Greece and the early Olympics that started back in 1896, when the French reconstituted the Olympics, they brought back the original idea. There was poetry, there was music in the original Olympics. And to the Greeks and to the early French who brought back the Olympics, that was important, right? We're going to have athletic, but we're also going to have culture, right? Poetry, music, art. There were art competitions. You could win a gold medal in the Olympics for art. We don't have that anymore. But that was, people weren't interested in it, so they just dropped it.
Well, nowadays art is just throw paint on the board. And that's
yeah, there's too many categories.
But what is
But what is art? What is truth? Okay? So that's our quick run through of Greek art. We're not going to be, so on the test, I'm not going to be asking you anything past Archaic. So that was just to give you kind of an idea of where we're going. And I'd like to give you just a quick overview of where we are. That way you kind of get a sense of how art progresses. Yep. Yep. And that's why on the handout there's only, notes for all the way up to Archaic. Okay? Sir? Yeah.